Good evening. Welcome to our fifth ZSL Science and Conservation event of the 23-24 season. So my name is Lewis Rowden. I'm the evidence-based animal care manager for ZSL, so working within the curatorial team across our two conservation zoos. And very pleased to be here tonight chairing the session where we've got some great speakers to tell you a little bit about some of the work that happens in our science and conservation zoos. So now on to the event itself. So we spent quite a bit of time as a group thinking about what to call this event, and you can see we've settled on the science of saving species. So saving species is an absolutely essential but probably quite ambitious target that organisations like ZSL and colleagues have been aiming to achieve. But rather than try and cover all of that very complicated, busy process tonight, we are going to focus specifically on some of the more hidden elements of species conservation. So perhaps those things that we talk about a little bit less or a bit harder to publicise. So thinking really about the behaviour, health and welfare of animals and species involved in species recovery programmes. So that's enough from me, I think. We'll get straight on to our first speaker of the night, who is Jim Mackie. So Jim is our Animal Behaviour Management Officer from ZSL, working across both London and Whipsnade Zoo. So he's responsible for managing our environmental enrichment and behaviour management training programmes in the zoo, focusing on animal welfare, but has increasingly been involved in species recovery work with our colleagues as well. So I'm going to hand over to Jim now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lewis. So we've got these fancy lapel mics. Are they working? Can you hear me okay? Excellent. All right, that's amazing. I've just hot-footed it back from the West Midlands Safari Park, where it's a BIASA Mammal Working Group conference talking about training of gibbons today. That's been quite interesting. But as Lewis says, my job is the Animal Behaviour Management Officer, and that incorporates enrichment and training of animals around the two zoos. And what does that have to do with conservation, you may ask? Well, actually, a lot, because every time that we ask an animal to do a behaviour that's species typical, so a natural behaviour in a zoo setting that's part of a conservation breeding programme, we're essentially setting those animals up for success in the future, both through passing on the behaviours from one animal to the next in terms of generational, but also in terms of reintroductions as well. And I wanted to just cover a couple of case studies here that might be of interest to you. So what we're going to be talking about here is behaviour management. Now, if you were to define behaviour management, yes, it's those topics of training and enrichment, which help to provide good well-being and welfare for our animals in the zoos. But behaviour management essentially is, in my description of it, is helping to find out what behaviours we'd like the animals to do and promoting those behaviours, and then finding out things that they maybe shouldn't be doing so much of, and try and decrease those or replace them with other behaviours as well. So I want to take you back a few years to 2016, when we opened up a new exhibit called Land of the Lions here at ZSL London Zoo. And as part of that programme, we had a memorandum of understanding with a couple of organisations in India. First of all, the Wildlife Institute of India, and then the Gujarat Forest Department. And we worked together collaboratively to help the conservation breeding programme of Asiatic lions in the wild, of which there's around 600 left. They got down to about 11 individual animals over in the Gujarat state, and the Indian government and other conservation bodies over there did this amazing programme, and that's what recovered this species. And ZSL got involved in order to build capacity over there, and it had various different components, including we helped with a new technique to do patrol-based monitoring over in the Gujarat forest, in the Gir forest, and we had the wildlife health and education, and then we had our part, which was the zoo science part, which was all about behaviour management and helping the animals that were in captivity, so in the breeding programme, become better at being lions, if you like, and ready for reintroduction back into the wild if that was going to happen. And you can just about see me here as part of this great group here, and look how happy I am to be in India. I was absolutely delighted. It's one of the most exciting things I've ever done in my career. And so we went over to the Gujarat state, the Sakarburg Zoo, where that arrow is, the HQ for the conservation breeding programme. Now, what had been identified prior to our visit to the zoo was that there was major problems in terms of behaviour with the Asiatic lions that were being either in captivity to be ready to be reintroduced, so those in human-animal conflict, so they'd stop in the zoo for a while and then be relocated, but also ones that were being bred for re-release into the wild as well, and also just the ones that were staying there for the breeding program. And a lot of those behaviours were things like apathy. And this was to do really with the way that they were being managed. So their behaviour management wasn't really looked into. So they were being fed just pieces of flesh off the bone into inside houses, which is unnaturalistic feeding. So we wanted to get hold of that. And so we did a little bit of research and sent it out to our colleagues out in India to see whether this was some of the things that we could experiment with and trial with the lions over there. What we wanted to do was to try and meet species-typical behaviours. Now, there used to be a thing called species-specific behaviours, which is kind of suggesting that all behaviours in animals is innate, and they pop out factory settings, if you like. There are innate behaviours, but everything is shaped by consequences, operant conditioning. So what we try and do is we try and think about ways to meet species-typical behavioural needs. And as you can see here, squeamish, look away now. This is the head and neck of a freshly culled deer. It's nice and warm. And lions love this kind of thing. Now, it's really hard to replicate the kill bite and other behaviours associated with hunting with captive animals, with captive lions. But look at that behaviour. That behaviour incorporates many different behaviours, not just a bite. There's tons of stuff going on there. And it's extremely physically challenging to the animal, and cognitively challenging too, because he's got his conspecifics there, so the other lions in the enclosure that he's got to try and figure out if he needs to compete with. These are natural species-typical behaviours that lions need to know if they're going to hunt animals in the wild. So when we went out to India, we were able to put some of those things into practice. And this was the focal pair that we used as part of our program to help teach the Gujarat Forest State personnel and also the Wildlife Institute of India personnel. So we did some olfactory stimulation to replicate that use of olfactory senses in order to get these animals to be hunted. Remember, these animals had never had enriched feeding before, the ones that have been bred in captivity here. And so if they are going to be reintroduced in the future, then the guys that look after them needed those skills, needed that skill set to teach the lions how to hunt. So that's some olfactory enrichment going on there that you can see. And then you can see this amazing video. Watch what happens here. This reminds me of seeing a couple of kittens, really, in given a toy for the first time. And as you can see, it's like really tentative, And these are amazingly powerful beasts, Look at them. These lions are incredible. And that's all it is a freshly killed buffalo leg, hanging up there. So it's the first time they've seen something, anything like that before. So you can see this amazing behaviour. And so the guys, particularly the director of the zoo, who was really keen on this conservation programme and this collaboration, and was absolutely delighted when he saw the results of our workshop. Now, this was a 10-day workshop, but we worked with those groups for a period of 3 or 4 years. And the legacy of this is really, really good, because it means that all of the zoos around India are now going to the Zuckerberg Zoo in order to learn about behaviour management techniques, which should, in theory, have a really big impact on the reintroduction programme. So there you go, a bit of an insight there. So just to give you a bit of a graph to prove that we're scientists, here you go, we increase species-typical behaviours, particularly in those curious animals, which they define as ones that would come to the front of the enclosure in the pre-workshop study. Okay, so the second case study I'd like to, is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of India there. That was like, a big part of my life, but there it goes. This is the hen harrier behaviour management and monitoring that we ran with the guys from Natural England. So when you're looking at a behaviour programme, here are some of the criteria that we like to achieve. So proactive and preventative rather than reactive. A lot of the time in the zoo, we do things because animals need help. And that means we're being reactive. But if we can get in there ahead of the game, then we can help these animals. We want to match natural behaviour repertoire, those species-typical behaviours, and provide the least intrusive, effective method of management. So these guys here were taken out of the wild in France. So these are hen harriers that were going to be reintroduced into the UK as part of a breeding programme. But they were showing extremely undesired behaviour patterns in their enclosure after they've been taken out of the wild, where they were likely to be killed up in the harvesting, so they nest in cornfields. So they popped into this aviary and they were doing this repetitive circling behaviour that was damaging their feet. So this was the enclosure down in the south of England where they're going to be reintroduced, and we wanted to stop those behaviours occurring and help these animals with their breeding. So very limited enclosure provision, as you can see in that before we collaborated with Natural England. And we were looking at these kind of behaviours with our hen harriers. We wanted to see this food passing, and we wanted to see nest building. Those are two species-typical behaviours that we need to see if these animals are going to successfully breed in captivity. And when we're designing enclosures, what we want to do is we want to design a habitat that means we don't have to add inputs into the habitat at all. We want these animals to be left alone, and we can do minimal servicing. And so when we're looking at naturalistic design, it's all about promoting species-typical behaviours in order to promote our breeding success for future reintroductions. And when we're mitigating against stressful situations, we think about what is the critical consequence of behaviour with our animals. A lot of the time, it's to do with distance from stressors. So we were asking the guys when they're doing any servicing, is that if the animals are nice and calm, they walk away. Simple as that. And that's how you deal with the stressors of captive management of birds that are potentially extremely stressed in that environment. We added in some stuff about dynamic perching, which enabled them to fix their feet. Those feet were a problem. We brought them into the zoo for a little visit and showed them some really cool things with our birds. As you can see here, this is a Chilean buzzard eagle, and we do continual health monitoring. Now, we're not going to be hands-on with the hen harriers in the same way, but it just showed that there's there's potential for continual health monitoring with our harriers that's going to be uninvasive. And then, of course, that enrichment. So the enriched feeding opportunities that we can give a hen harrier in a small aviary is pretty minimal, but we're able to show some of the cool things that we could do with birds in the zoo. So we did tons of stuff. And then we got a brilliant update from the guys at Natural England just the other day when we said, we would really like to talk about this amazing project that we collaborated with, and it included a research component as well of cameras in those aviaries to see how these guys were behaving. And this was it. So no one has bred hen harriers in captivity before. It's a brand new project. But just in the year that Jemima Parry-Jones had them in the enclosures over in the ICPB, we were seeing these amazing behaviours that we'd identified in the beginning of this collaborative effort. And the project staff were delighted to see early courtship and breeding behaviours take place too. So that's the first year. So hopefully, watch this space, you might see hen harriers flying over the cornfields of southern England, which hasn't happened for, well, however long. It's an amazing achievement if they can do it. So thanks ever so much for listening to my little bit. I'm going to pass over to the other guys. I'm really looking forward to hearing what they've got to talk about, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks ever so much for coming. For that.
Amanda's More lions. Never can have more lions. Thanks very much, Jim. So next up is Amanda Ferguson. So Amanda is our diet management officer for ZSL. So again, working across the two zoos, looking very much at the nutrient science that's important to be aware of, but thinking about behaviourally how this can be impactful as well. So over to Amanda.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Let's check this one. Food. Right, well, food contains all the nutrition and the chemicals and the energy that we need, that animals, people need to survive. And the nutritional content of that diet really has a fundamental impact on the health of the animal. So it is really deserving of our thought, and it's something that we do give a lot of thought about when we're looking after animals in the zoo, and particularly when we're talking about animals that are in conservation programs. So really, in terms of optimal nutrition, it impacts longevity. So if you've got good nutrition, it's what Jim was talking about earlier, being preventative, then we can get longevity. It also lowers disease incidence. And as lovely as vets are, we really don't like to see vets very much. So hopefully we'll have less veterinary intervention, because that's always stressful for animals and people, and there's always a cost to it. So if we can optimise the health of animals, then hopefully we can also optimise their reproduction. So breeding and rearing young, that increases population sustainability, that can be within the zoo or in the wild populations. It can help achieve our conservation goals, and it enhances our reputation as well. So there's a number of conservation approaches that actually mean we intervene in animals' diets, either to some large degree or a small degree. So just some examples, we've got ex-situ breeding. A number of these animals are at the zoo in our Extinct in the Wild programme. So you can see the parchula snails up there. We have to replicate kind of the algae that grows under leaves for them. There's also head starting, is when we take out juvenile, it's birds, normally in wader birds. We take out the juvenile birds at a very critical period, which they don't survive. You know, it's very difficult for them to survive in the wild, rear them in captivity, and then pot them back in the wild. There's cases where animals are taken into managed care. So an example here was the Seychelles magpie robin. Well, in fact, all the birds on Frigate Island were caught up for a period of a few months while rats were eradicated from the island. And then, of course, there's supplementary feeding to support any populations that we've reintroduced or small populations. London Zoo's involved in the Institute of Zoology is involved in the hee-hee, and of course the Mauritius kestrel as well. And as Jim mentioned, translocations, when we're moving animals from one spot to another, like those lions, they were held in managed care for a few months before they were relocated to other areas. So there's a whole suite of interventions there when we do need to think very carefully about diet. So in the zoo, we're thinking about diet formulation, and there's really a triangle of needs that we need to satisfy for these animals. So firstly, there's nutrition, but also, really importantly, there's the behavioural aspects and the physiological aspects, and these animals need to have those needs satisfied. If we don't satisfy them, there's going to be consequences. They've had years of evolution, and they need to use those adaptations they've got. So that we consider that with diets, but that's not really what I'm going to focus on talking about today. I'm going to concentrate on nutrition, so just slight revisiting of your GCSE biology here. These are the nutrients that are required. Protein, fat, carbohydrate, a suite of minerals, a suite of vitamins, water, and fibre is not really a nutrient, but it's certainly something we have to consider for the animals because it's so important for gut health, and in particular for ruminants. So these have a whole wealth of functions in the body that are absolutely essential. The protein, fat, and carbohydrate also provide calories, energy that we need to carry out all our essential life functions, but of course we don't want too much because you get fat situation and that impacts on breeding. The diet needs to be balanced. All those nutrients need to be offered in a balanced way. And if you're very lucky for the animal you're working with, there'll be best practice guidelines with a good nutrition section. If not, and to be honest, with most of these animals we're working with, they really haven't been studied to that degree. So we have to kind of extrapolate from nutrient requirements that have been determined for probably farm animals or companion animals or laboratory animals. So what I do if I'm thinking about assessing a diet is I have to look at what it's composed of in terms of nutrients. The first thing I need to know is what the animal's eating. I need to know how much of all the different items it's eating. And I don't want someone to write that down for me. I need to go, or somebody needs to go and do an intake study, because very often what you say the animal's eating is actually not what it's eating. It looks easy, but this is actually very hard to do in practice. So the next thing I need to do is for all those items that are in the diet, I need to work out what's in those in terms of nutrients. So there's a number of food tables that are available. We use that one quite a lot. This is the government one, so all human foods are on there, so all our fruit and veg, etc. But of course, for a lot of the animal foods, that's not there. So we share a lot of data with other zoos, but we quite often just have to send it off to a laboratory and get it analysed, and they'll come back and tell us exactly what's in it. Once we've got those two aspects about the diet, we can then calculate the nutritional composition. You can do it manually, or we use a computer software program. And this is the kind of thing that we get out. We use one called Nutrition, and it will list the diet and all the nutrients in the diet, and I mean, there's a lot of them. Needs some skilled interpretation, this, because it won't tell you what's right or wrong, and there's also a number of stages of kind of where the data doesn't really add up, so you need to be aware of those. And then what you do is you compare that to the guidelines, and you can see where your gaps are, and you can see how you need to tweak your diet. And in that program, you can manipulate the diet items and see what brings your calcium up to the right level. So I'll just go through a few case studies now that I've worked on, and the first one is the corncrake. This was This bird is an iconic farmland bird that sadly is no more across most of England. There's still a population in Scotland. There's a small population in the Nene washes in Cambridgeshire, and we were involved with a breed and release programme there with other colleagues and partners as well. Whipsnade Zoo, they were bred and released, and the vets were involved in the disease screening as well. It's a migratory bird, so it goes to Africa and then comes back to breed in the United Kingdom. So with the corncrake, the birds were reared for the first 2 weeks. They were reared at Whipsnade. The breeding group was at Whipsnade, and they were reared. They have to be bred inside. We don't want them looking at the stars, seeing the sky, because that's how they navigate their way home. And we don't want them to come back to Whipsnade. We wanted them to go back to the Nene. So for 2 weeks, they were at Whipsnade, and then they had a health check, and all was well. If all was well, they went on to these pens, which were in situ at the release site. And there they were for only not long, really, up till they were about 6 weeks old. But what was happening at the pre-release health checks there was that we found out that a lot of these birds had fractures. They had some form of metabolic bone disease. So I was asked, and this is a nutritional disease, so I was asked to come and look at the diet. So this is what they were being fed. They were being fed a pellet and some supplements. We call this the rearing mix, and then they were being fed a whole load of live food as well. So I did my intake study there. And you can see from this, the only bit you need to look at really is here. You can see the first 2 weeks at Whipsnade, we've got quite consistent here and are eating a lot of rearing mix. As soon as in week 3 onwards, when they went to the Nene, you can see this drops drastically, and they move over to just eating live food. So if we look at that in terms of nutrition, here we go. You can see that the calcium here, which was quite high, but fine for a growing bird, it drops to a really low level, and it drops below the recommendations for chickens. There's no recommendations for corncrakes, so we have to use chickens, and it drops below that. So we can see immediately they're just not getting enough calcium. Very low. They were low in vitamin D as well. Not as low, but again, that wasn't help because that all combines with the calcium mechanisms in the body. So what do? We had some remedial actions. We insisted that the rearing mix was offered the whole time. The rangers there had declined really from giving the rearing mix because they said the birds weren't interested in it and they wanted the birds to get used to eating live food. But actually that had nutritional consequences that were really bad for their health. So we got the rearing mix offered all the time. We changed the presentation so they would eat more of it. Importantly, we supplemented our invertebrates that we were feeding them. We gut-loaded them and dusted them. We changed some invertebrate species to some that have higher calcium, and we created basking areas in the pens. We cleared some of the grass that the corncrakes like to hide in, because we did see basking behaviour, and when they bask, they make vitamin D. The sunshine makes vitamin D. So we got lower MBD incidents and more birds were released, and that was great. And we also got a publication because we looked at how best to measure vitamin D in those birds. So the second case study is the mountain chicken. These are a huge frog from the Caribbean, used to occur on lots of islands, but now just on Montserrat and Dominique. And they really face a huge amount of threats. Overexploitation because they were hunted and eaten. I mean, they're just under 1 kilo in the wild, so they're big, and they were a big food source for the people there. Habitat loss, introduced predators, there's rats on these islands, extreme events, volcanoes, and disease. The main one is chytrid fungus, so they're really having a tough time. In 2009, there was an ex-situ breeding program developed, which turned into the Mountain Chicken Recovery Program, consortium approach, lots of people involved. So with this captive breeding, of course, they're relying on us for all their food, but actually, pretty soon there became evident there was nutritional disease occurring, bone development wasn't right, there was fractures, so again, that was found to be down to vitamin D. The HERP guys here worked on some research on that and found providing UVB, artificial sunlight, resolved that problem. But as this review of postmortems and deaths found that there's still quite a few things that were that could be the diseases that are impacted by nutrition. So we wanted to go back to basics, we wanted to do some research, go and look at what they're eating in the wild, the nutritional composition of what they're eating in the wild, and also in captivity, and see, where we weren't meeting up. So we were very lucky. There's a study in the wild done in the 80s looking actually at stomach contents of these mountain chickens. So we had a really good idea of what the wild population was, all these different things, and quantified as well. But we didn't know what the nutrition composition of those were. So here's one of our vets who went out and basically spent most of her time catching invertebrates and bringing them back for analysis. For our zoo animals, which are being fed these as their diet, we had all these analysed, and we also did an intake study. And then we sent them all off for analysis to the laboratory, and then we popped them all in our programme. And I haven't got time to talk about too much of this, but the one that's just really important here is you can look at the energy and the fat of these commercially produced insects, and you can see they are, so there's twice as much energy in the invertebrates we are feeding them, and 4 times as much fat. I mean, they're huge little fat balls, so there's a bit of an issue there. Having a closer look at fat, we looked at the different types of fats, how saturated they were, not too much difference there, so that's okay. But when we started to look again at the different types of fat, like the omega-3s and the omega-6 fats, you may have heard of those because omega-3s are very big in human nutrition. They confer lots of health benefits. And when we looked at those, they're very different in the captive population than what we're feeding, the wild ones are eating. And the wild ones are eating a lot more of the omega-3s. And the ratios are huge, 2.4 to 1 and 17 to 1. Big, big difference. So actually the fact we're not feeding them enough of these omega-3s may well impact some of those diseases that I mentioned earlier that we're seeing at post-mortem. So that's an area we want to try and work on. So in terms of the nutrition, we've got now a live food breeding unit here. So we're doing lots of work with Ross, who's our colleague that runs that, to try and get more research done so that we can better inform husbandry guidelines for future efforts. And the third and final case study is the hazel dormouse, super cute. These have been, ZSL is involved with these. It's another captive breeding program, but ZSL houses the young animals, and before they're put out, they're here for 10 weeks for health screening. Take our health screening very seriously, and we need to produce healthy, viable young for release. I got involved because some of them, they weren't sure they were feeding the right stuff, and some of them were a little bit fat. So again, I looked at the diet. This is the original diet. There's nuts and seeds, some produce, and then a kind of mix of corn and basically bird food that's high protein for them. So did an intake study. Did a couple of intake studies on them actually, and we did this. We separated all the food items and put them in these little pill boxes, and then weighed and measured them over 2 weeks. So we can see that the animals, because they were fed different food items, the animals could actually express a preference. So these are the things they really liked: the grape, the sunflower seeds, lots of sugar, lots of fat, all sugar, really, until you get down to mixed corn, which again, well, there's not really much in mixed corn either. But by this level, they're only eating about 12% of it, and these are all the good ones. The insectivorous mix and the egg food have got protein in, hazelnuts, again, very dense. The reason they're not eating the hazelnut is that they were fed whole, and they actually couldn't break into the shells, the hard shells. The egg food perplexed us because there was actually more of that after the intake study, but then we found out they were weeing in that pot, so they were very clearly letting us know that they did not like to eat that one. Basically, last year we changed the diet. We trialled a couple of different pellets that were complete pellets, and we really limited the other food that's given to them. But we still did want some variety, so we got a mealworm in there to give them a bit of protein and a bit of difference. And we're trying to keep native fruits. I know that's a blueberry, but they were given blackberries as well. And basically for 2004, we're going to do that very detailed repetition of the intake study, and hopefully publish this and put it into the guidelines that are going to help moving forward. Because even though the animals were surviving here, they may not be very fit for their post-release survival. So that's something else that we want to look at. But that's the importance of a diet. You don't often see the effects immediately, as in the animal doesn't immediately produce a disease and that, but it's very important for the animal's fitness, so that when they're under times of stress, like a reintroduction, that's when they're not going to survive. So that's it. Thank you very much to everyone. These are our mountain chickens that have just bred, so you can go and see those in the new Secret Life of Reptiles and Amphibians, so we're super happy with that, and thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Amanda. So thinking about the nutrition and behaviour stuff will lead us very nicely on to Dr. Amanda Trask, who's a postdoctoral research associate in the Institute of Zoology here at ZSL. Her research focuses primarily on species recovery, and at the moment she's doing some very interesting work with sihek, or the Guam kingfisher. So I'll pass you straight over to Amanda so she can explain a bit more. Thank you, Amanda.
So, as Lewis said, I'm going to talk about female bias mortalities in the ex-situ management of the extinct in the wild sihek, or Guam kingfisher. So, sihek are a bird that's endemic to the island of Guam in the Pacific. After the accidental introduction of brown tree snakes to the island, sihek were sadly extirpated from the wild by 1988. Luckily, before all of the sihek were extirpated, a few of them were able to be caught and taken into human care to found a breeding program. And the current population is now about 135 birds in zoos in the US mainland and on Guam. There's active species recovery planning going on for the sihek, with releases actually aimed for later this year. So these would be the first releases of this species back to the wild in over 35 years. And recovery of the sihek requires a healthy ex-situ population. This is so that the ex-situ population can act as insurance against total extinction of the species, but also so that we can support those releases back to the wild. So we need an ex-situ population that has a high enough population growth rate that we can produce hatchlings for these releases, but also so that it can sustain that ex-situ population's viability as well. So let's take a look at how the ex-situ population is doing. So this black line shows the total number of individuals in the population through time. The blue line shows the number of males in the population, and the red line shows the number of females. So you can see that slowly through time, the number of males to females has been diverging, so that we now have a male by sex ratio in the population. And this is to the point where we have 1.7 males to every 1 female. This is important because this is a monogamous species, so we now, this limits the number of breeding pairs that we can form. It's also important from a logistical point of view, because we now have a surplus of males that we need to house, but they're not actively contributing to the breeding program. And it also presents genetic threats, because a male by sex ratio means that the effective to census population size is reduced. So this means that there's an increased rate of loss of genetic diversity and an increased rate of inbreeding than there would be if this was an even sex ratio. So what we first did to try and understand what's going on here was to understand the demographic rate underlying that male by sex ratio. So a sex ratio bias can be caused by the primary sex ratio. So this is if there are more males than females being born into the population. So to examine this, we looked at the sex ratio at about 30 days post-hatch. So that's when the plumage sexual dimorphism starts to occur, where the females in the species have a white-coloured breast and the males have this solid cinnamon colour. So at this point, when we looked at sex ratio, the sex ratio didn't differ significantly from 1 to 1. So we don't think this is an issue with the primary sex ratio. So what else could it be? So on this graph shows cumulative survivorship, where the males are shown in blue, the females in red. And you can see that initially, up to about 3 years of age, there isn't a difference in cumulative survivorship, but after this point, they start to diverge quite dramatically. And we find that the male sihek have a significantly greater survival probability than the females in the population. And this is actually to the point where the median lifespan for adult females is about 5.7 years, but the median lifespan for the males is about 7.1 years. So what's causing this male-biased, this higher female mortality rate? So to look at this, we decided to review necropsy reports from the population throughout the breeding program. And we classified these different causes of death in the necropsy reports into these broad categories of causes of death that you can see on this graph here. And then we looked at the frequency of occurrence in the males and females to see whether they differed significantly, and we found that the causes of death did differ significantly between males and females, and we think that this was mainly being caused by this high occurrence of reproductive diseases in the female sihek, and no occurrences of diseases affecting the reproductive system in the male sihek. And this was actually to the point where reproductive disease was the second most common cause of death in the female sihek, and it actually made up 16% of our recorded causes of death in the necropsy reports. And that's actually quite a high frequency of occurrence compared to other non-domesticated bird species, where there's an occurrence of reproductive diseases of about 8.9%. Then we wanted to go one step further and look at sex and age-specific differences in causes of death. So on these graphs, you can see the same different categories of causes of death along the side, but now on the x-axis is age at death, and the red shows the females, the blue shows the males. And what I want you to focus on is these metabolic and nutritional diseases, where we found a significant interaction between sex and age at death, where we found female sihek were dying at significantly younger ages from metabolic and nutritional diseases than the males. So we think that this higher rate of mortalities in the females is being caused by this higher occurrence of reproductive diseases and also this younger age at death from metabolic and nutritional diseases. So that review of necropsies tells us about the proximate causes of death, but we're still interested in the underlying processes. So why do these females have a higher occurrence of reproductive diseases, and why are they dying at younger ages from nutritional metabolic diseases? So we were interested in the body weights of the birds and their reproductive effort. So we're interested in body weight because we know that there's issues with weight management in this species. There's quite high occurrences of obesity. And we were interested in reproductive effort because from farmed bird species like poultry, we know that high egg-laying rates are associated with occurrences of reproductive diseases. So we built multi-state survival models with state-dependent survival and transition probabilities. So this is where we categorized individuals into different body weight categories, so low, mid, high, unknown weight states. And then for reproductive effort, we categorized them into producing hatchlings or not each year. And then we can estimate the survival probability that's associated with each of these states, and also the probability of transitioning between these states. And this is what we find. So on this graph, on the y-axis is survival probability, and along the x-axis is low, mid, high, and unknown weight states. And then the orange shows individuals in not breeding states, so not producing hatchlings, whereas the dark blue shows individuals who are in a breeding state. If we first look at individuals who are in that low weight state, we find that, so firstly, we could only estimate this for individuals who were low weight and not breeding, because we didn't have enough individuals who were low weight and breeding to be able to estimate an associated survival probability. But for these individuals who were low weight and not breeding, we found that this was associated with a low survival probability compared to the other states. So that's potentially not that surprising, because low weight may be an indicator of other health issues that could be impacting survival, as opposed to it being the weight itself that's driving that low survival. If we then look at individuals who are in this mid-weight category, so we find that being mid-weight is associated with a relatively high survival probability, but it seems to be dependent on whether you're breeding or not in a given year. In particular, if you're actually producing hatchlings, this seems to be associated with a higher survival probability than if you're not producing hatchlings. So that's the opposite of what we would expect if there was a survival cost to reproduction. So what we think could be happening here is something similar to the low weight state individuals, where hatchling production may be an indicator of good health. So if you're healthy enough to be producing hatchlings, you may also be healthy enough to survive to the following year. If we then look at individuals in our high weight state, so we actually found that being in a high weight state was associated with a relatively high survival probability. So that's not what we were expecting to find, because we were quite concerned about weight and we thought that might be impacting survival. But this actually suggests that they have a relatively high survival probability to the following year. And then the other thing that we can get from this analysis is our transition probabilities. So here, if we focus on individuals in this mid-weight and breeding state, so that's our kind of desirable state in the population, because if you're mid-weight, we think that's a healthy weight for the birds to be, and it's a weight where they're able to express their natural behaviours. And breeding, because as we're getting this population ready for releases, it's likely that we're going to want a lot of the individuals to be in this breeding state. So what's the probability of transitioning from our other states into this desirable mid-weight and breeding state? So firstly, if we look at individuals who are in this low weight, not breeding state, we actually find a very low probability of transitioning from being low weight, not breeding, to being mid-weight and breeding the following year. So this is quite bad news if you're a low-weight individual. You have a low survival probability, and you also have a low probability of transitioning out of that, that state into a kind of more desirable state. If we look at individuals who are high weight and not breeding, we also find a low probability of transitioning out of that state into our desirable mid-weight breeding state. And then even for individuals who are mid-weight and currently not breeding, we found a low probability of transitioning to being a breeder the following year. So it seems that if you're currently not breeding, you have a low probability of becoming a breeder the following year. But what we did find was that if you're currently high weight and breeding, then you have a relatively high probability of being mid-weight and breeding the following year. So that's good news for these high weight individuals, because not only does this high weight potentially not actually impact your survival very much, but even if there are some health issues associated with it, you have a relatively high probability of becoming mid-weight the following year. So the next thing we thought about was actually, is hatchling production the best way of measuring reproductive effort in the sihek? Because we know that there's relatively high hatching failure rates in the sihek population. So this hatching failure work is work that's being carried out by a PhD student, Matt Mitchell, who's also at the IZ. And if sihek have this high hatching failure rate, then actually for individuals who might be producing a lot of eggs, if none of these eggs go on to hatch, we would still be classing them as a not breeder, even though they have a high reproductive effort. So we decided to redo our analysis, but defining reproductive effort as individuals who are in a breeding situation or not. So by a breeding situation, I mean individuals who are they're currently in a breeding pair and keepers are actively trying to breed from them. So on this graph then, we have the same survival probability on the y-axis, those same weight categories along the x-axis, but now we have the dark blue indicating individuals in a breeding situation, orange indicating individuals not in a breeding situation, and then we also have this green which shows individuals in an unknown breeding situation. So that's because this data is less complete than our hatchling production data. So firstly, we still have that same relationship with the weight states, where if you're low weight, this is associated with a relatively low survival probability, but being mid-weight or high weight is associated with relatively high survival probabilities. But if we focus on individuals in this mid-weight state, so for females, we again find that your survival probability seems to be dependent on whether you're breeding or not in a given year. But for males, we don't find this. And in particular for the females, if you're midweight and in a breeding situation, this is actually associated with a lower survival probability than if you're not in a breeding situation. So that suggests that for females, there could actually be some survival cost to being in a breeding situation. So this is something that we really need to understand what's going on here, because as we're getting this population ready for releases, it's likely that we're going to need a lot of these females to be in a breeding situation, but we don't really want that to be impacting their survival. So in conclusion, in this population, we find higher male than female survival rate, and that's what we think is causing this male by sex ratio. And we think this high female mortality rate is being caused by the higher occurrence of reproductive diseases and earlier age at death from nutritional metabolic diseases. We think that survival is associated with weight and reproductive states, with being midweight associated with a high survival probability, but for females in particular, there's a survival cost to being in a breeding situation. We think that low weight is associated with a relatively low survival probability, but we think that this is probably because low weight may be an indicator of other health issues, as opposed to the low weight being the driver of that low survival probability. And then if you're high weight, we think this is associated with a relatively high survival probability. So that could suggest that that weight isn't as much of an issue as we thought it was for this population, but it's also important to remember that this analysis was looking at your current weight and whether that was impacting survival to the following year. However, for something like weight, this is likely to have chronic impacts that may have delayed effects on survival, so might not be impacting your survival to the following year, but could impact survival throughout the next few years or on your lifespan. So that's something that we're still currently looking at. And it's important for us to understand the underlying causes of this high female mortality rate so that we can increase female survival rate and optimize species recovery potential so that we can get this species back out into the wild. So thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Amanda. So this brings us on to our last talk of the evening from Dr. María Díez León, who is a senior lecturer in animal welfare at the Royal Veterinary College. So Maria, I'm sure, will tell us a bit more about her work, which looks a lot at behavioural and physiological measures of welfare, but also how we can take this information and look to see how species recovery from captivity might affect conservation potential. So over to Maria for more.
Thanks, Louis. Good evening, everyone. And first, I'd like to thank ZSL for inviting me to speak here to all of you tonight about a topic that I'm passionate about, and I devote my research career towards it now. I could talk for days about this topic, and I have 15 minutes, so I'll do my best. So we'll see what I can do. I'm gonna divide the talk and first zoom out a little bit and talk a bit more about the sort of general why studying behavior, why do we care about behavior when we talk about conservation breeding programs, and Jim already introduced a little bit of this for me, so hopefully it's all been like, okay, we follow this fine. And then specifically as to how this is relevant for the conservation breeding program of the critically endangered European mink. So animals in the wild, they are constantly challenged by their environment, and they need to show behavioral flexibility to respond to these challenges. If any of you is watching Mammals on the BBC, there's tons of examples right now, very cool footage on exactly how animals are constantly having to flexibly adapt to what the environment throws at them. In addition, they've also evolved specific behaviors, or as Jim put it, species-typical behaviors that have evolved to give them a survival and reproductive advantage in these environments. Now, in contrast, in captive settings, so be it a zoo or a conservation breeding center, things are just different despite of our best efforts. The environment in which we keep them at is not just different in size, but is also different in complexity, but also different in terms of how many relative challenges compared to what they would be experiencing in the wild we can provide these animals with. So what you have there on the left is an example of an enclosure from a water vole breeding facility, and to your right, it's an example from a black-footed ferret conservation breeding facility in North America. And environments in captive settings are like this as well for very good reasons. On the one hand, we need numbers, as Amanda was saying, like we need, especially preparing for release, we're gonna need to have as many animals as we can within a limited space and with limited resources. So we need to maximize how many individuals we can have at a given time. And also for good examples, as Amanda said as well, in terms of health checks and monitoring of the animals while they are under our care, so to ensure their welfare. So there's good reasons for why these environmental differences between the two wild and captive breeding settings. Now, the consequence in terms of behavior is that we know behaviors can be lost, and the two main ways in which environmental conditions in conservation breeding programs affect the behavior of animals is that because of the removal of evolutionary pressures such as predation, of disease in the environment, there's some loss of behavior and appearance of other behaviors. So because behavior is plastic, and we'll come back to that at the end of the talk, animals adapt to their new environments as well. But we also see, because of particularly when animals are reared in these less challenging environments, if you will, we saw this general lack of behavioral flexibility that might affect how the animals behave as adults as well. So this explains part of the behavioral challenges we see in these programs. And we face behavioral challenges at all the stages of the program. So we see issues in the ex-situ stage when we're breeding animals before they're going to be released. So this is the stage in which we need animals to mate and produce offspring that survive to be released, and also in the in-situ reintroduction stage. So we need those offspring to be released, because normally it's the offspring, it depends on the species and the program, but typically it's juveniles that are released, so we need them to be able to survive and reproduce once they are released. So at both these stages, we can see issues that are consistent with this loss of behavior or lack of behavioral flexibility. So we see things like genetically recommended pairs. When we put them together, they don't seem to be behaviorally compatible, and that might be argued for lack of mate choice, but also some abnormal mating behaviors, and we're going to see more of this when I talk about the European mink. We can also see high rates of infant mortality in some cases, in which they can be due to poor maternal or parental care. And when the animals are reintroduced, we can see, particularly in carnivores, carnivore reintroductions, high rates of, captive-born individuals do less well in terms of survivals in the wild compared to wild-born individuals. And for carnivores, at least, this has been shown several people have shown this for carnivore species. Again, this is like a brushstroke of things that might happen. This doesn't mean that all captive breeding programs for all species have these issues. Some species have none of this, and they do beautifully. Others have suffer from all of these issues. For some species might be just at this stage, for some at the upper stage. It's just like an overall overview. But basically, there's something about the captive environment that might affect the behavior of these animals, which might then challenge the conservation breeding outcomes. So, how does this apply to the European mink at all? Before I move any further, I'm going to test the audience on their zoological knowledge. So, how many of you think that these individuals here belong to the same species? Hands up if you think they're all the same species. Okay. Hands up if you think they're different species. All right. You can all keep your Cedacell fellowship. You passed. So these are two different species. Can anybody venture which species is the two on that side? European mink, correct. And over here we have an American mink. So European mink, American mink, European mink, there are two different species. If you cannot tell, the European mink there has the sort of white upper lip and lower lip. The American mink only has white in the lower lip or the chin. European mink, critically endangered species. American mink, they were introduced in Europe for the fur industry about 200 years ago, and now the feral populations threaten the populations of, say, native birds and rodents. So the water vole is an example in the UK that is being threatened by the American mink. By the way, you don't have European mink in the UK, and it looks like you never did, but you now have American mink that is threatening other populations of species. So, the situation of the European mink in the wild is dire. The most recent estimates suggest is fewer than 5,000 European mink left in the wild, and the major threats are the introduced American mink and habitat fragmentation. If you can see in that map is the dark, I don't know if you can even see them, the dark colored green areas are the areas with confirmed free-living wild European mink, and areas in Spain, France, and Estonia, where they have active reintroductions. The paler green ones are suspected sightings. All the red is the Foreman range, where there are no more. And the bad news is there's American mink all over that red range as well. So it's not looking fantastic. So there's active, so the European mink survival really relies on this conservation breeding followed by reintroduction at the moment. And there's active reintroductions in Estonia and Spain. France has been breeding for a couple of years, and they will be ready to release soon. And there's question marks whether other countries will start, but right now only Estonia and Spain have active reintroductions, and France will follow soon. Now, if the situation in the wild wasn't bad enough, we have the additional problem that in captivity, most of the captive-born males fail to mate. And this is really worrying because right now, most of the captive population is composed of captive-born males because there's so few wild mink out there, that we don't want to be supplementing the population by having to capture wild mink and bringing them into captivity. So most of the population is captive-born males, and we have this problem. So what the non-mating males are doing differently, what do they not do? So reproductively, physiology-wise, they seem to be fine. So reproductive physiology, stress physiology seems fine. Sperm quality, as far as we know, it seems all right as well. But what they do is they behave really aggressively or really passively in the presence of receptive females. And in addition, they don't seem to produce this clucking vocalization or chuckle during the courtship. So essentially, successful males basically sing to the females. Non-successful males, they might attempt to breed, but they do not do this singing, and they don't succeed. So what you see there is like a massive mind map that we have going on at the Conservation Breeding Center in Estonia, in which we just draw new lines and new sort of evidence as we find it with the different studies to try and figure out why animals, why a male European mink are behaving or not behaving this way. So we have a series of experiments, and I'll try to cover a little bit of it so you have an idea. There's no graphs because a lot of this is ongoing. So we have just preliminary results of things that we think might be causing this abnormal behavior in captivity. So we're focusing on things that we know are different from the wild environment in the way we manage them in captivity. So one of the things we know is different is that the spatial density and the distribution of the sexes in captivity is very different to that in the wild. Over there you have my terrible attempt at drawing territories for the mink, and also the reason why I never make it to art school. So the blue bigger circles are supposed to be male territories that encircle orange circles that are the female territory. So outside of the breeding season, males hold territories that might have some several females in their territory, but they don't mix with each other. However, during the breeding season in the wild, we think this is more permeable, and males come across other males as they are trying to search for females and mate with other females. Now look in captivity, and basically the individual males and females have no choice as to how many neighbors they have and what's the sex of the neighbors. So we ran a study to try and assess whether neighbor density and sex predicted male copulatory behavior, and it did. So males that were housed with more males during breeding season had higher chances to mate in the following breeding season. We also look at whether this aggressive or passive behavior that had been reported in the presence of a female, whether it was sort of the iceberg of a personality trait, whether we had different personalities year-round outside of the breeding season that could predict which males were going to breed or not breed. And here you have Crystal Nemvels, who is the EEP coordinator, so she coordinates all the breeding of these animals across European zoos. And she did her master's by research on this. So she did behavioral tests of personality and also asked keepers about the personality of the mink outside of the breeding season. And again, males that were rated as more aggressive were less likely to copulate. And if they did, they had fewer offspring than males that were more bold or exploratory. We're also looking at adding extra complexity in the environment and see how that affects mating behavior, but also reintroduction, survival, and behavior once released. So also focusing on things that they might have in the natural environment, such as they use the vertical space a bit more than how we have them now in captivity, and also providing extra resting sites or denning sites, because in the wild they would have several dens across a territory, but in captivity typically they have one nest box. So trying to provide more of what it would be the complexity of the environment in the wild. So far, we don't have signs that this is affecting mating dramatically, but we're going to see if it affects the navigational skills when reintroduced. Trying to go fast. Well, we're putting a lot of our coins, I think we're our hopes as well is in the studies about the early social environment of these individuals. I'm going to try and play this video here. You're going to see a female. It's been really tricky to try and get cameras into the nest boxes in a very non-invasive way. You see a curl female with her litter of pups or kids suckling. So these are altricial animals, so they are born without fur and without the ability to thermoregulate. And we know from research in other species that at this stage in the development, maternal care is crucial for behavioral development as adults. So we want to look into whether maternal behavior, but also play behavior and how we manage weaning, because right now weaning also happens quite differently than in the wild. It happens abruptly and earlier than it would normally. So, and we know that's a trigger for abnormal behavior in other species. So we want to see if this affects the behavior of the juveniles and then their sexual behavior as adults, particularly in regards to this production of vocalization. And I'll just leave you with the final bit, which is to tie this all together and try to look at how the behavior since when they are born, how it affects their survival and navigational skills when reintroduced. You're gonna, if you can focus your eyes over there, you will see the head of a European mink pup. So this is a like a cage for a hard release. So mink has been trapped there and then put directly into the environment in which it's going to be released. The door is open and the mink goes out. It's in slow motion because they are really fast. So in reality, the mink just bolts, but you're going to see like a very slow moving mink coming out of there. So you see the head up there, turns away from us and just runs. So we're looking as well as if any behavior that we record and welfare and physiological metrics from when they're in captivity predicts how they behave at the moment of release and also later on in terms of the navigational skills and how much they use the water, because they are semi-aquatic animals, so how much they use the water and denning sites in their new habitats. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks to lots of people, and thank you as well for listening.
Okay, thanks very much, Maria. So that was, the end of our talk. So we're going to get our 4 speakers to come and sit on the stage now, so you guys can all ask some questions. But hopefully that's shown you guys, I guess, a brief snapshot into several different ways we can do science around health and behaviour and welfare to inform our species recovery work. So everyone take your seats, and then hopefully we're going to have some questions from the audience. So we've got some roaming microphones around the sides, so if anyone with questions, if you just pop your hand up and then wait for the microphone to come to you, and then we'll get the questions answered. So any questions? We have one at the front here. Thank you.
Well, firstly, thank you all for your insights this evening. It's very inspiring. This might be slightly off topic to ask, but I'm intrigued to know. In the last 6 months, there's been lots of reports and headlines about how AI has been used to support modern medicine in very different ways. And I'm very interested to know if it's infiltrated your industry as of yet. If so, how? And if not, when and how do you think it will affect all of the different areas you're working in? And how will you use it?
Can I just ask AI as in not artificial insemination, which has also infiltrated this field. Well, I was just saying that because for the first time they were trying to artificially inseminate European mink in Spain, so it was like, which one? So I'll answer from me, and then so it's starting to, in terms of behavior recording. I don't know if you saw in one of the pictures there, one of my PhD students is recording data, behavioral data from cameras, by hand, pretty much. So there's starting to be work on trying to automate, and Lewis knows a lot about this as well, trying to automate behavioral recording from video footage. So it started to, but there's a huge work that needs to be done in terms of validating that. So sometimes the algorithms pick up, say, active and inactive, but we're after way more granular behaviors, if you will. So to validate that, you need all the hours of somebody watching and telling the AI, this is, licking the offspring, this is feeding, this is da-da-da. So it's starting to happen, but I think it still needs. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's going that way, I think, and yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree. So it's really useful for those really big data sets, but for the sihek, that's actually quite a small data set. We don't have very many individuals, so we haven't had to use it so far. I could see where it could be useful once we start releasing individuals into the wild. So, for example, like with camera traps, where you have, where you can potentially get a lot of images from a camera trap, and then you need to quite quickly automate, like recognizing what that's seeing. So once we start releasing sihek into the wild, if that could be one way of monitoring them, like having camera traps out or having like audio recording or something like that. So maybe AI would be useful for that kind of thing, like post-release monitoring. But at the moment, we haven't used it so far.
Because if I just can follow a second. Yeah, because it's a huge challenge is to follow these animals in terms of behavior once they are released. Because normally what the data that you get from radio collars is, distance travel and survived or not. But to get, the type of behavior that we can, or behavior detail that we can get when we have them in the conservation breeding setting, we lose a lot of that once they are released. So it'd be great to be able to get more granularity there.
I think in terms of zoo management, we and how that impacts with the conservation breeding programs that we do in ex-situ, which is in the zoos. There isn't AI used as such yet, but technology is a really interesting area. Things like, we talked about operant conditioning, which is the Skinnerian stuff, and that originally started in laboratories with pigeons and rats in boxes. And I feel like there's going to be a major, like a really big breakthrough in the next sort of couple of decades in the use of that kind of technology. So remotely operated operant conditioning to help to manage animals, so we don't have to have contact with them, because a lot of our training programs rely on human-animal relationship, which is built through positive reinforcement, and it's often the person interacting with the animal, which in conservation breeding and reintroduction you don't want it. But it's nice to reduce stress levels, overall stress levels, while still maintaining the respect and fear of people when they're out in the wild. And we've had a lot of examples of questions about that with things like tigers being released and leopards, and also Californian condors that were constantly interacting with people. So I think there's an interesting area there. It's not really AI, so it's a bit off topic there, but it's a great question. But the technology side of things, I suppose it will all kind of be relevant in the future, yeah.
Yeah, I think the same with the feeding, really, the technology side's the side that we could really go. Because again, ideally, there's a lot of animal reaction to the provider of food. So if we can do that automatically, and then we can, just things like feed really early in the morning to fit in with their natural photo period, etc. So again, the technology in that way, rather than AI, I can think is the thing that's coming along at the moment.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Any other questions in the room? Yeah, we've got one down the front. Thank you.
This is obviously looking forward quite far, but if you got to the point of reintroduction, where you are quite confident in reintroducing a species into an area, would you think about possibly modifying behaviour further from just going back to flexibility and behaviour, but also sort of maybe choosing some negative behaviour to get rid of and positive ones that would be normal for the wild, but you might want to get rid of?
There's tons of examples of that actually already out there. It's a great question. Ken Ramirez, who's a very famous animal trainer in the States, has worked on a lot of conservation programs. Some of them are to do with human-animal conflict, so polar bears encroaching into towns, and how we use punishment, which is, I won't go into too much detail. Punishment just means decreasing behaviour, so that's quite an interesting area. But also using then reinforcers to take those animals into areas where they can gain resources that they get in those human areas. There's loads. I mean, I could talk for quite a while about it, but there is another resource that you can read. It's a great article by Ken talking about migration routes of elephants and providing watering holes so that it becomes you know, behaviourally more relevant and useful to them to take those routes instead of the ones where the poachers hang out. You know, so there's loads of cool stuff out there. And even the Guam kingfisher, they're doing an audio recall so that they can bring, right, when they reintroduce them, they want to bring them back into an area so they can monitor them easier. That's right, isn't it? So it's a nice bit of operant conditioning right there.
Yeah, so I think that will be for the ones that are initially released so that we can make sure that they're getting enough food after that release. But I guess longer term, that's not a behaviour that we'd maybe want. But for those ones where the first release is, you know, where we need to make sure they have enough food, so we want to call them back as we feed them. But once we have a self-sustaining population, it just might not be needed, that kind of thing.
I think they did that with blue-throated macaws in Bolivia as well, didn't they? When they reintroduced those, that initial monitoring phase, they wanted to bring them back to a location they could check the tags and stuff. And then the Californian condor, they did actually do a program. There was a program that taught them to stay away from human habitations and populations as well. So, and there's stuff about that online you can find. We try and find those resources for everyone. All right.
Thanks.
Good question.
Thanks for the question. Any other questions? We've got one just at the back row.
Hi Jim, Amanda, Lewis.
Hello.
Oh, Sam. Hello.
My question might be quite loaded, so I'm just going to unload it and pitch in where and when you can. So how do you measure species-typical behaviours and whether they're successful or not, as well as those behaviours that species might display that aren't quite typical to their wild repertoire, such as like puzzle solving, something like that, relating to elephants more so. And also, is there much research going into the nutrient density of different types of browse given to species in captivity, as well as the effects of limiting species of browse to species of browse to species in captivity, and how that affects behaviour repertoire, whether it limits that or creates certain dilemmas. So feeding more species of browse at one time, what can that do to animals, as well as limiting the species? Because obviously in captivity we are fairly limited, but I wanted to know if anything was going on with that I could take back to section. Yep.
Thanks, Sam. Should we go with the behaviour questions first? Who wants to tackle that in terms of
The measuring part?
measuring.
Yeah, so because we don't have the AI ready yet, it's lots of hours of recording behavior. So first, I mean, I don't know if you had any behaviors in mind in particular, but, and sorry if this is all like you all know this already, but you would like create an ethogram, which is basically you define the behaviors you're going to record in an objective and ambiguous way so that they cannot be confused with anything else. So anybody recording them would record exactly the same thing. And then depends on what you're interested in terms of, is it the frequency of the behavior that you want to record, the duration of behavior that you want to record. There's different methodologies to do that. And then you would ensure that you are like sounds nice, but recording 24/7 continuous behavior, like we would all die if we were to do that. So for more than maybe a day we would manage. But so there's these established ways like schedules of recording behavior that give you essentially the same information, but sampling at specific points. So you would say if there's a specific individual that say Jim wants to record the behavior of at the zoo, he would like come up with a monitoring schedule for that animal across several days to sort of stop variation, day-to-day variation. And if there's a specific event he wants to say, oh, is this behavior going to change when we give them browse or not? He would create a design to record behavior for enough days before the event to have a baseline, and then during the event, and then again repeat the recording after the baseline to see if there's any change on the behavior. Have I covered it more or less?
I think so.
Does that answer the question, of the first part of your question?
Thank you.
I may have to repeat the browse question.
So I think it's basically, is there any research or any idea about the effect of feeding browse to our animals that we might be giving less diversity of browse to the animals that they would naturally maybe come across
Yeah, I mean, and browse is a real issue, isn't it? We can never really provide enough or the variety. So there's a couple of hypotheses really like in the wild, and we see it sometimes in our zoo animals as that they're fussy or they go off things. And one theory is that browse also has a lot of anti-nutrients in it to try and prevent animals from eating it. So what the animal does is it decides to go from species to species. So it's not overloading itself with one toxin, it's kind of going to different species and getting a different batch of toxins, but it can deal with each of those. And so you'll often find that, in particular, say, with animals like a carp and giraffe that can be really fussy, and part of it may be because we're not giving them enough diversity to eat. I don't think elephants are quite as specific as that. Have you noticed that with your animals? Are they fussy about the browse they get?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I found they can be quite fussy, especially if they have, say, oak over a long period of time, because I believe that's got more tannins than other species of browse. But I believe there was a study done not so long ago where they monitored a herd eating different species of browse, and often the older elephants went to species that they preferred most, and then the younger elephants would eat less preferred species than the older elephants. And so in a herd that obviously has influence on their relationship dynamics as well as their nutrition that they're eating. So I just wondered how we can potentially replicate that or help.
Yeah, and if you can offer more browse, then you're much more liable to see that kind of behaviour developing, because they've got the opportunity to express that behaviour. Browse also varies in nutritional content. It's really it's very, very variable. It varies depending on species, clearly, time of year. Each year is different. We want our horticultural department here selected about 40 trees a few years ago, and they sampled every spring, summer, autumn, and in the winter as well for the twigs. The same trees over about 5 years, and it's really variable. It depends so much on weather conditions, and of course trees here are going to be different from whipsnade, so all of those things are going to have slightly different effects on the animal and its choice of what it's going to eat. So there's a lot going on with browse, and we don't know a huge amount about it, and we're really working at the lowest common denominator in zoos because we have limited browse available. But yes, it's always interesting to look at your observations, to critically watch your animals and see how they cope with the different types of animals and the choices they've got with the different types of browse, and their interactions between them, because again, it's quite motivating for animals if they're really, if there's a high value food, you may see different feeding behaviours develop around that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Thank you. I had a question regarding the sihek, Graham kingfisher. I guess it was twofold. So the first one was about the brown tree snake still being extant on Guam. Are there any more updates about attempts to remove those? And given that the kingfishers will be reintroduced this year, how will you avoid the snakes essentially from eating those kingfishers? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are still brown tree snakes on Guam, and they are trying to remove them. So they do things like drop mice that have poison in them, and then the brown tree snakes eat those poisoned mice to kill them that way. There's also snake traps and things like that on the island. But so we're not releasing them back to Guam this year. We're going to Palmyra Atoll. So that's a different location. So it's quite a small atoll, also in the Pacific. And we think has similar enough habitat that the sihek should be okay there. And we've done risk assessments to make sure that they're not going to impact any of the other species there. So there's no native forest birds or kingfishers on that atoll for any kind of negative interactions there. But yeah, so it is one of those it is these sad situations in extinct in the wild species where sometimes that's the reason that they haven't been reintroduced yet. Because if Guam was fine and free of snakes, you would be able to just put them back, hopefully. Yes, instead we're having to go down the assisted colonization route at the moment and put them in a different location. But the long-term plan is to put them back onto Guam, and that is either after the snake population has been reduced to an amount that people have decided is okay, or potentially creating snake-free areas, so like putting snake-proof fences up and excluding snakes from those areas. So that's potential things that people are looking at into the future. Yeah, but currently it's assisted colonizations elsewhere. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
We still have a question?
Yeah.
In this.
Hi, yeah, thank you for the talk, it was great. That was actually really similar to my question, but I guess bringing it over to the American mink and the European mink as well, is it the same kind of thing that you would do in having kind of areas that are protected for the European mink, or yeah, how would you deal with in that context?
Yeah, so the first releases ever were done off an island of Scotland, yes, Estonia. Similar weather. So they basically cleared a small island of American mink and started reintroducing European mink as a sort of test situation. Can we even, if we control the population of American mink, can the European mink be reestablished? And that was yes. In the rest of continental Europe, so currently in Spain, the releases go hand in hand with active eradication of American mink. And right now they're trying to explore sites that are further away from, so it's basically, they're working around river basins to push down the American mink so they don't colonize further up, and then try to establish other habitats within the area that still is relatively free of American mink, to start new areas to release them. But yeah, like the main challenge is at the minute is trying to manage both, like keep the American mink population at a level that that the European mink can successfully recolonize. But it's really tricky because with the case of the European mink, I don't know with the sihek, but the European mink are smaller than the American mink, so the American mink basically outcompete them in the wild. So it's not even like, European mink and otters can live in similar environments because they use the habitat differently. The otters are more aquatic. But with American mink, they compete directly, and American mink are bigger. They start reproducing earlier in the year, so by the time European mink pups are this small, the American ones are already like eating or using the resources available in the same environment. So it's complicated, yeah.
Thank you. So we've probably got time for one more quick question, if there is one in the room. I'm scanning. I realise I should have put this slide up before, but oh yeah, we've got one down at the front, if we could get, thank you.
Just talk. This is very off topic. How are the baby lions doing?
Great.
When do you think they'll be coming out?
Yeah, they'll be out soon, and it's entirely up to the to Mum really. She's very good. She's a good mum. She had a bespoke birthing plan, not a pool with music and stuff like that. It was very much about limiting her access to areas. It's actually almost, it sounds counterintuitive, but giving her the cubbing dens, and that really sparked that kind of maternal process off with her. And yeah, she's doing ever so well. So hopefully, fingers crossed, you'll see them out and about this summer.
That's a nice note to end it on. So I think I just want to give a round of applause and thanks to our 4 very brilliant speakers. And also to our other ZSL colleagues around the room and who have helped organise the event tonight. And obviously to all of you for coming. It's been great to have your attention and have your questions. So I don't know if the slide will show up on the screen, but we have a thank you slide with some important QR codes and a link. So that feedback form we mentioned at the beginning, if you wouldn't mind just maybe filling that in through the QR codes, that would be much appreciated. And the next Science and Conservation event here at ZSL in the evening is in May, looking at migratory fish, which is a difficult thing for me to say. So threatened species and how we can mitigate those threats. So yeah, keep an eye out on on web pages for that information. I hope to see you there. And again, thank you very much for coming and have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.